All right, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. A warm welcome to the first in this series of international expert forums, where we today will focus on organized crime, conflict, extremism, and peace building. My name is Zajac-Sannerholm. I'm with the Folke Bernadotte Academy, or FBA. It's a Swedish government agency for peace, security, and development. I'm the acting research director at FBA and also heads the Rule of Law program at the Academy. The International Expert Forum is a partnership and joint initiative between Folke Bernadotte Academy, IPI, Center for International Peace Operations, and SecDev Foundation. And I would also like to take this opportunity to welcome you all also on behalf of the Center for International Peace Operations-ZIF and our partners at SecDev as well, who unfortunately could not be with us here today, but who I suspect will follow this on the live streaming that is now up and running as well. Okay, a few practicalities first. Should you wish to tweet during the day, and you are very welcome to do so during the day, please use the following hashtag IEForum with the as one name, hashtag IEForum with the first three letters as capital letters. Second, as you now figured out as well, this is a live streaming. You can access the link through IPI webpage and also through the streaming link through FBA's web pages as well. And that's for the first opening sessions and the Ignite sessions as well. And you have in front of you agendas for today, so that's up until roughly 11:15. Okay, the event today is the first of 4 meetings under the overarching theme of peace building in the 21st century. And IEF, or International Expert Forum, is designed to be a basic platform where practitioners, researchers, and policymakers can meet and discuss current and future challenges. It is set around a very basic or simple premise. So what works and what doesn't? Yet that very basic and simple premise hides also a main challenge. How do you tackle the complex issues that we will discuss here today in the future meetings as well in peace building and peacekeeping environments? We, FBA and partners IPI, ZIF and SecDev, see the international expert forums as a meeting point, as, if you will, Ignite meetings as well, where many of the topics we covered today are too broad for one day. So we see this as running through a continuous discussion. We also have had a previous round of international expert forums in this constellation of partners, focusing then on primarily peacekeeping, moving from preventive diplomacy to mitigating the consequences of violent conflict, to peacekeeping and durability of peace. And the last part in the first round of international expert forums was on peace building and post-conflict recovery. And documentation from all of these meetings can be found and accessed on FBA and IPI web pages. So we are today starting the second round of International Experts Forum, focusing on and exploring the topic of peace building. And we do so by looking at different complex issues and topics, but also on connections as a running theme throughout all these meetings that we will have. Connections between global threats and peace building practice. So the first meeting in the International Expert, or IEF series, is this one today on peace building and organized crime. 3 more will follow next year. The first of those 3 will be peace building in cities, peace building and governance and social contract, and last but certainly not least, for the latter part of next year, peace building and climate change. So we are now launching a new IEF on peace building, where we also look broader at peace building. Peace building in terms of a broader topic, but also involving more actors. The usual suspects are, of course, those we also seek to engage and have stimulating discussions with: the UN, EU, OSCE, AU, and other similar such actors. And of course also state agencies at a bilateral level. But also including in that spectrum of factors involved in peace building, we reach out to non-state actors, non-governmental organizations, professional networks, think tanks, research institutes, and corporations as well. Returning back to the theme for today, organized crime and peace building, It poses a direct threat to peacebuilding as a process as we know it, and to peace builders both. For individuals living in societies where organized crime is pervasive and has taken hold, organized crime affects everyday life in many direct and disastrous ways. To borrow a well-known phrase, individuals in these societies live under conditions where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. We know today that peace building is not, it's a broad spectrum of activities that falls under peace building. And so when we look at organized crime as part of this and strategies designed or devised to tackle it, it cannot be seen as a single sector activity or a single dimension activity as well. Above all, it's clear from the rapidly emerging literature on organized crime that strategies to confront organized crime and extremism should not be viewed from a technical perspective alone, but rather from a political economy perspective. That organized crime seems to thrive in environments where the political, economic, and social factors in conjunction provides easy access, safety, opportunities of control and manipulation. So while the challenges thus put are humbling, so too is emerging research field, which is often very practically oriented. And so too are the policy discussions that are being held in different forums on this issue. And both of these together and in parallel are causes for realistic optimism in a sense. So with that, again, we'd like to wish you all very warm welcome on behalf of FBA and also our partners at ZIF and SecDev. We look forward to stimulating discussions and presentation during the course of this day. And again, we see this as start of a longer-term process, the first of 4 meetings on the theme of peace building in the 21st century. So with that, I hand over to Francesco Mancini to say a few words on behalf of IPI. Okay.
Great, thank you, Richard. Welcome also on behalf of IPI to this first International Access Forum, which is focusing on the connections between peace building and conflict, organized crime, and extremism. I'm Francesco Mancini. I used to be the director of research of this place until I moved to Singapore a few months ago. But there are still a few things I'm involved in, and that's one of those. So I'm very happy to be back home in some ways. And I appreciated your participation. I know these are all very busy times before the end of the year. I'm not gonna to spend time in telling you the importance of the connection between crime, extremism, and conflict, because that's precisely what our expert will do. At the same time, when we started to think about what themes we should include in our thinking about the future of peace building, we thought that these two elements ought to be part of it. Because in some way, crime has always been singled out on a separate shelf, like fiction and crime in a bookstore. When it comes to security, governance, and development. And I think we are a community that realizes that actually these are part of the same narrative. And this is something that is acknowledged. At the same time, I think there is still a lot to do and to think on one, what is really the nature of these connections are, and second, what are the implications for our policy response. And I know there is a lot of people doing work on this, and we hope that we gather here some of these experts who can give some of their insights to share. I cannot think of a better way to start off this, not only this event, but this series, with our keynote speaker today, who is Oscar Fernández-Taranco, who is the new Assistant Secretary General for Peacebuilding Support. And so also on behalf of my behalf and IPI, congratulations for your new post. Mr. Fernández-Taranco comes with a massive experience across the UN system, both in headquarters and the field. So I think that is something that is extremely interesting when it comes to peace building, because in some way this seminar is taking a very broad idea of peace building, not just what is under sort of the peace building architecture of the UN, but peace building as a sort of a framing concept of ideas of a lot of the things the UN does in the rubric of international peace and security. And so having a broad perspective of the UN system, I think, is quite essential when it comes to peace building. The way we will do it, we will have a short keynote. And then Mr. Fernández-Taranco has been kind enough to be open to take some questions and engage in a conversation with you before we move into the expert session. So without further ado, Mr. Fernández-Taranco, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And let me start off by thanking the organizers of this event and for actually giving us, I think, the UN in general and the PBSO in particular today, a platform, an opportunity to start sharing some of the thoughts we have on some of these critical issues that have been very well framed. First of all, and just in line with the title and the framing of this session, let me warmly welcome you all to the 21st century. A century which I think has basically started back in 1989, when we saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, and when we started seeing essentially capitalism and democracy becoming a much more of a global phenomenon. It was also the year when the computer scientist Tim Berners-Lee wrote his famous proposal for what eventually became the World Wide Web. And in a way, both these two factors have driven globalization, which has also facilitated transnational organized crime, the dissemination of extremism around the globe, and global terrorism networks. As a result, these issues of transnational organized crime, terrorism, and extremisms are global issues today, and they will be difficult to fight unless we have a global strategy, and we are able to mobilize a global effort. Today, any deficit in the effort in one country almost instantaneously has an impact on other countries, whether this is through the economic linkages, the migration, displacement, terrorism, piracy, organized crime, narcotics, human trafficking, arms trades, etc. The progressive globalization keeps increasing the likelihood of these cross-border spillovers. And 1989 was very much like 1914, sort of a year of important paradigm shifts. Since '89, we have seen a much more fragile, a much more interconnected, a much more crisis-prone, multipolar world where the borders are increasingly, being shifting and with multidimensional problems. 1989 was also a watershed year for the UN. It was really after then that we started seeing many more peacekeeping operations, many different types of peacekeeping operations and special political missions with multidimensional mandates and much more complex challenges in terms of operation in the field. It's also since then that the Security Council has been using sanctions many more times, and sanctions with a widening range of purposes, to reverse aggression, to restore democracy, to protect human rights, to end wars, to combat terrorism, and support peace agreements. The Security Council also has broadened its own interpretations of threats to international peace and security, and as we've seen, also the increasing reactions to some of the humanitarian crises and interventions we've been seeing, the whole dimension of responsibility to protect, the response to AIDS, the response to Ebola, as well as the passing of the famous Resolution 1325. I think also what's important to note here is that since 1989, the nature of conflicts has been shifting, has been evolving. We've seen that armed violence has moved basically from an interstate fora to wars of independence and increasingly to civil wars, and now much more to the more amorphous type of wars that we are amorphous violence that we are confronting. And wars and their lethality actually declined since the early 1990s, maybe a big part of this due to the end of the Cold War, the spread of democracy, the expanding international economic integration, the expansion of human rights, international law, international peace operations, etc. But we see this persistence of a number of violent conflicts, including the new ones, which are rather intractable, they are recurring, and are amorphous. William Reno actually wrote about these countless little wars, as he refers to them, with no front lines, no battlefields, no uniforms, no clear conflict zones, no distinction between combatants and civilians. And today, actually, violence very might well involve, ragtag rebels, gangs, organized crime, and the high homicide rates that we see in certain parts of the world. Battle-related deaths today are comparatively low, actually, compared to the wars of the distant past. But today, homicide rates are much bigger than many of the deaths incurred during the civil wars recently in Central America, for example. And so the factors driving a lot of these violent conflicts are more complex, more multidimensional. In the past, many of the wars were often about political goals. And today, we see that the conflict drivers are a combination of political, economic, and social issues, environmental and justice dimensions, the socio-economic inequalities among groups, issues of political exclusion, the lack of voice, conflicts over natural resources and the distribution of their benefits, the lack of jobs, grievances over corruption, perceived or real injustices, human rights abuses, etc. These are all very powerful drivers of conflict. And so it's difficult to define this agenda in a clear manner, since factors are often very interrelated and morph into each other and/or change over time. And so the nexus that we're discussing here today between organized crime and terrorism is precisely part of that trend. We see in many, many parts of the world terrorism actually being increasingly financed by crime, including the trafficking of drugs, of natural resources, of kidnappings, as we see places like Afghanistan and Colombia and West Africa. So traditional instruments such as diplomacy or military means have not necessarily been that effective. Military means to fight terrorism alone might actually have the adverse effects of actually feeding extremism. So if the drivers are multidimensional, we need to be thinking about multidimensional approaches that span the development, the political, the military, justice spectrum. And the current thinking about fighting organized crime and terrorism emphasizes this more whole-of-government approach. So this is where peacebuilding actually comes in. As you rightly stated, so peacebuilding is about combining the efforts of the UN system to reduce these risks of relapse into violence and to create actually the foundations for sustainable peace. It is about that joint coherent efforts around common strategies of peacekeeping operations, of special political missions, and the UN country teams consisting of the agencies, funds, and programs. I would also include the World Bank as well. And actually, the issues of covering both military, police, political, development, and human rights interventions. And I think this is something that has been a great challenge to the UN on how we do this integration across these different areas of work. Many of these activities actually contribute to conditions that make the fight against organized crime and terrorism easier. Increasing security, strengthening the rule of law, judicial institutions, enhancing participation in decision-making, creating jobs, and strengthening livelihoods, addressing human rights abuses. These are all very important instruments in the fight against organized crime and terrorism. And peace building in itself is not, the magic bullet we would hope to have. So let me maybe highlight two aspects of peace building that we believe are essential in the fight against organized crime and terrorism and extremism. And some of these issues are actually covered in the Secretary General's report that will soon be discussed in the Council. One key aspect is this notion of inclusivity. The Secretary General's report on peace building describes and is focused on the need for inclusive processes to reduce the risk of relapse into violence. Exclusion, political, social, economic, is one of the most consistent factors in the breakdown of peace. And extremism is partly related to this marginalization of certain groups within countries. Peace building is very much about the dialogue and focuses on improving the state-society relations and social cohesion among groups. So community-led approaches are very important in peace building and can also play an important role in the early recognition and countering of extremism. This could include, of course, the outreach that is necessary when working from a community-based angle, the outreach with youth organizations and groups, civil society organizations, the media, religious leaders, and educators. And again, community-level approaches clearly also need to be connected to the wider national processes for them to be effective. The second aspect of peace building that I think is relevant for this issue is this domain of institution building and extension of state authority. And again, in many of the post-conflict countries, we see the state is absent or very weak outside of the capital cities, where usually most of our missions are located, with insecurity, lack of access to justice, and poor service delivery. This leaves vacuums, creates vacuums, and leaves rooms for others to actually fill the void. And so terrorist groups and organized crimes, sometimes in collaboration, thrive precisely in areas where the state is absent, whether it's in Afghanistan, in the Sahel, or Somalia. In fact, in some, as Eli Berman has argued, one of the main organizing principles of terrorist organizations is the delivery of social services. There is also evidence that criminal groups work in very similar fashions. So building the capacity of the state to deliver services such as security, justice, healthcare, and education throughout the country is critical in the fight against extremism, terrorism, organized crime, and actually is the foundation on which you reinforce trust and the legitimacy of the governments, and certainly is extremely important for improving the state-society relations. So inclusive institution building, which includes political processes and dialogue on the design, the role, the objective, the functions of the state, is extremely important and can contribute to the ownership of state institutions and a sense of national identity and social cohesion. This came out very interestingly in the case of South Africa during the security sector reform and the constitutional reforms. This, in fact, is and can be an important antidote to alternative identities, whether they're based on religion, ethnicity, or gangs. So again, inclusive institution building processes. Let me now mention just a few challenges of peace building in the UN with regard to addressing organized crime and extremism. Again, the UN and the way we work is, we're essentially focused on the state. So community approaches in direct and regular engagement with populations is often very challenging, very difficult to undertake. And in some cases, and increasingly, because the UN itself has become the target of terrorism, and many of our colleagues who are in the front line have been forced to stay within compounds, thus limiting that direct engagement with communities, particularly where we have strong presence of organized crime and terrorism. The work of the UN is also mostly concentrated and focused and is country-based. So it is quite a challenge to address transnational issues. Cross-border operations for the UN is maybe one of the most challenging issues that we are confronted with. And then we also have few missions whose mandate actually are focused on combating organized crime and terrorism, although this is increasingly a big part of the debate within the Security Council. I think as one of the reports that you have here that you've just issued actually also echoes and states, the analysis and information gathering on organized crime and terrorism in real time is also very weak. A big challenge for the UN on this. And the last is the flexibility and adaptation when circumstances change is quite limited and is an area where the UN should be doing much more. In 2015, as you all know, the General Assembly and the Security Council are going to be conducting a 10-year review of the peacebuilding architecture. It will be a major opportunity. This external member states-driven review, as well as the Secretary General's own internal review of peace operations, both will be a major opportunity to analyze the UN's ability to address these new kinds of threats and violent conflicts. It will and should allow the member states to reshape the peacebuilding architecture, including the Peacebuilding Commission. In order to achieve this, again, we will need, very engaged, bold, determined participation and commitment from the member states themselves. We believe that the original motivation behind the establishment of the Peacebuilding Commission still remains valid. The Peacebuilding Commission does have a role to play to bring to bear this notion of the collective political weight of member states. Political stakeholders, regional neighbors, donors, troop contributors, again, all in support of the UN leadership on the ground and mandates and operations of the UN that assist national peacebuilding efforts on the ground. The Peacebuilding Commission can also allow for the participation of a wider range of actors, including countries in the region, regional and sub-regional organizations, including the World Bank, in this more coherent manner of confronting these new threats to peace and security. This is particularly relevant, I would say, when dealing with this notion of fighting organized crime and terrorism and the rising threats of extremism. So hopefully this review will establish exactly, how the landscape of the international engagements in conflict-afflicted countries has changed, and what niche there still remains for the Peacebuilding Commission and our own office in support of that, and as well the role that the Peacebuilding Fund can be playing. So again, a very important, notion of this review will be the detailed case studies and the experience that we're able to gain from the different experience on the ground that would drive a series of recommendations for member states. It will be extremely important, in our view, that these two reviews, the internal and member state mandate one, actually are mutually reinforcing each other, and that we do and have synergies between these two processes. Equally important, of course, will be the high-level review on Security Council Resolution 1325 on the role of women, peace, and security. So again, we believe this 2015 review is very timely, it's very opportune, a great opportunity to refocus our efforts and to see what are those remaining gaps and what are the challenges going forward in terms of how we configure our presence and how we're able to redefine UN coherence across the board of different interventions to have a meaningful effect on the ground. Let me also just conclude then with just a note of caution on the use of the word extremism. I mean, it is becoming, the most recent buzzword, so to speak. If one were to take the recent World Development Report of the Bank, you will see that maybe this particular word is only referred to once in the whole report, whereas terrorism, terrorism at least is accounted to for at least 80 to 100 times. So it gives you a sense of, how quickly things change in a very short time in terms of how some of these issues are being framed. Maybe just to recall, just very recently, as Radhika Kumaraswamy recently argued, that we have to be careful, not to equate extremism with religious extremism and religious extremism with Islamic extremism, because I think much of what is out there is along these lines. And also important not to equate extremism with terrorism. There are separate dynamics here. And so maybe the label of extremist or extremism might not be helpful or contribute to the effectiveness of the interventions to prevent violence, as it's, it either sounds disparaging or labels ideas and the actors involved as incomprehensible or illegal. So in a setting where we're dealing with member states and the instruments that we have, maybe focusing again on what is driving the conflict and how we can actually be involved in this notion of response and prevention would be a very good opportunity to reframe the debate. So with these really very short comments and preliminary ideas, really to thank you all and to congratulate you for this process of series of rethinks, if you will, that I think will be very, very important part of the input to the internal reviews on peace building that will hopefully have an impact in the way the UN is able to be more responsive, flexible, and strategic. Thank you very much. Thank you. Grazie.
Thank you. That was, I think, a terrific way to start off our conversation. As I said, not only focusing on the theme of today, but broadly speaking about peace building. And I was wondering if I can take advantage of sort of your new fresh pair of eyes coming into the peace building architecture world of the UN. And you mentioned a few challenges of UN peace building, sort of state-centric approach, the working in silos, the risk of not really being good in working regionally across borders and so on and so forth, and across themes also. Do you have, let's say, a couple of priorities coming into the peace building support office that you are putting as a sort of top priorities to address, to strengthen the current UN mechanism? Do you have a couple of things that you can share with us?
Well,
should be on, but
okay, yeah. So again, this is week 2 into my new job, so it would be.
I anticipate a fresh eye.
Yes, no, it would be extremely fresh and very non-consulted, if you will, with many of the colleagues and teams that we have. But I think, I did mention two issues which I do think has strong relevance, not just to our own very small peace-building support office and its efforts to support the Peacebuilding Commission, but most importantly also the key departments and agencies who are actually doing the peace-building work in the field, namely, the important departments, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, Department of Political Affairs, and UN resident coordinators and UN country teams. The notion of inclusivity, I think, is an extremely important one. Inclusivity in terms of dialogue, in terms of how we actually address issues of reconciliation. How do we prevent much of what happens many times when we launch missions and we sort of deploy at times fast, many times not as fast as we should be doing. But by the time we have the full articulation of the mission in place, the political dynamics has moved much further down the road. And we're already seeing, the seeds of possible relapse are already being planted very quickly. So how rapidly we're able to accompany the political process and how rapidly we're able to go outside of capital cities to actually engage in the regions at the community level with many of the key, one can say almost non-state actors who are the key drivers of peace or war in many of these countries, fragile countries emerging from conflict. That would be a top priority. How do we better and more rapidly engage mediators? How we can rapidly and actively ensure that through the funding that we're able to provide rapidly in a catalytic manner, actually empower those parts of the UN system, be it UNDP, UNICEF, UNFPA, the agency who are also on the ground, to engage in meaningful interventions with many of the local communities. How we are able to articulate conflict prevention strategies. I think it's an extremely important point. Much of what we see in the form of relapse keeps coming back to what we've thought about or not while we were doing a conflict analysis. And I think the threat assessment and conflict analysis needs to be a running theme constantly. I mean, I think the threats of organized crime, as we see them play out, and terrorism and extremism, are things that are moving much, much faster than what we as a UN are able to keep ahead. So the issue of information analysis, the issue of building coalitions and strengthening the voice of moderation, tolerance, inclusivity, I think is an extremely important part of the equation. So having a better definition of how we do extension of state authority. I think this is something that is almost in every UN mission mandate these days, and it is something that we are challenged with. I think extension of state authority today has to be much more than placing a civil affairs officer in the middle of region X and calling that extension of state authority. This is an extension of the UN's presence on the ground, but how do we build bottom-up this relationship between citizens and state and use these dialogue mechanisms as a way of empowerment and creating legitimacy in these countries, I think would be very important. So essentially, peace building, a very political process that requires a lot of political analysis and rapid interpretation of the events. And again, redefining how the Peacebuilding Commission can be a more relevant political actor, operating possibly across, working with relevant regional actors and relevant neighbors. I mean, I think the particular challenge of organized crime, terrorism, and extremism is no longer in nationally defined, as we can see today in Central Africa, West Africa, Central Asia. And here, giving scope and space for action, a sort of a re-understanding or a redefinition of roles between the Council, the PBC, could be an interesting, there's a lot of room for reinterpretation. I think, as we all know, the Council is overwhelmed and overburdened with many, many crises, and there is a need to keep attention on some of these processes that eventually can spin out of control and end back in the Council. So the preventive role, the early action, the immediate response, and working with the operators on the ground, not just the UN actors who are mandated to do so, but increasingly with civil society actors and non-governmental entities. Right.
No, thank you very much. And I also am very glad that you mentioned during your remarks the sort of original intent of the peacebuilding architecture, which was very much cutting across silos and not actually creating new silos. And I think that's maybe one of the risks that, in these 10 years we've been witnessing of actually creating yet another silos. One of the things I've been saying for a couple of years that in some way I think we're still kind of operating under the sort of agenda for peace assumptions of 20 years ago, which was a very important document at that time, but also compartmentalized a lot the work of the UN in peace and security. And all the things that you have been mentioning make an argument for actually cutting across, right? Because of this inclusivity and institution building and so forth are all activity that requires multiple approaches. As ultimately we know, organized crime is not just a law enforcement issue, right? And there's all the other elements that come in. So maybe this is a hope that we have also for the peacebuilding review that will inject some of these elements into the conversation. I think I would like to take a few questions. We have a few minutes. Please, you can just briefly introduce yourself, also for the sake of those who are following us online. Would be great. Do we have a mic, please? Thank you. Oh, you can use, of course, the ones at the table.
Hello?
Thank you.
Oh, great.
Please.
Thank you very much. Chris O'Donnell from DPGO DDR section. First of all, thanks very much. I think the fact that you are coming in fresh, really you have a perspective that hasn't yet been siloed, which I think is something that happens to a lot of us, including myself, in the DDR section. So I really think you gave a nice broad view of the bigger picture, and that's well appreciated. And in doing so, I think the definitional issues that you brought up, some would say semantics, but have very real implications for our work And I think one of the things is that we're still struggling with some of the really age-old things that we never resolved. There's no agreed definition of terrorism, extremism. In my particular area of work, DDR candidates are called different things by different parties. They may be called terrorist, extremist, criminal. I call them DDR candidates. We may go further to call them a partner for peace, but people are very reluctant to say that. And it's not always the case that they will be, but I think we do need to look at that. In terms of the very real implications, because I don't think a academic debate about semantics is so useful, I have noted a very strong legal approach to terrorism, to be honest, in the UN. And I would like to hear your views on the assertion that terrorism is kind of a subset of organized crime, because I've heard those echoes a lot lately. And I would like to know, is this not in some way a contradiction of the community approach? And how possible is it for these kind of two approaches to be harmonized? And the reason I ask the legal thing, I mean, it goes back to the beginning, as I said, from this is an age-old thing. I started my career in Northern Ireland, and during the time of Margaret Thatcher, the old making the IRA criminals was huge in the 80s and had very, very real implications. And we're having the same thing right now, especially with DDR. We're in gray zones right now that are unbelievable. So in terms of harmonizing that, and a lot of the terrorism people that I'm not going to make lawyer jokes, but there's a lot of lawyers involved in it. And so that perspective, I feel, is overarching in the UN right now. So just want to see your perspective on how they might be harmonized. Thank you very much.
Is it okay I collect maybe a couple of... Okay. Anybody else? Okay, so maybe I leave you to do this, and then we go back.
Let's put it very simply. I think the question is extremely challenging, and I do hope that the high-level panelists who are being assembled to think about these things will actually delve into the legal dimensions, which I agree. I mean, a lot of what we are able or not able to do at the end of the day becomes an interpretation of the legality or not, and that's why my word of caution about how we frame some of these dynamics, because it either allows or not the UN to be able to engage or not at different times. I do believe, and it's interesting because similar groupings, organizations can be called different things according to the politics of the negotiation and the peace process as it moves forward. And both for state actors and non-state actors, how they're classified and how they're reclassified is an extremely important part of a process either going forward or actually going backwards. And so I think there's a lot to be thought about, and I think it's a very important question because just to take a very current, you were mentioning the challenges in Northern Ireland and the IRA. I mean, these are very similar challenges ongoing right now in Colombia with organizations that the government is actually actively engaged in, and where eventually the UN might be called precisely to come in and help accompany part of this process of demobilization, reintegration, and not just into economic life, but into the political life. So here we're talking about groups of people who today are considered one particular category, and the day after tomorrow, a different one. And so how we engage early on in these discussions, how we facilitate the process of de-radicalization, reintegration is an extremely important one. And it's not just the political negotiation, but it's how we engage with many of the so-called foot soldiers of these organized criminal organizations or so-called terrorist organizations or et cetera. So I haven't had enough time to think about it. I mean, you're prompting me to go back to the office and get my colleagues and others to start thinking about it. I think, again, and you know, because we're in early stages, I think there's a tremendous amount of thinking capacity in the UN right now that, whether it's in DPKO, DPA, UNDP, UNICEF, and across the board, OACHR, that some of these issues might warrant actually the type of coherent internal thinking in terms of what are the opportunities, the risk of going forward on some of these issues. Because as we can do that, we also have a legal department that also has its own ways of interacting with the rest of the system in terms of defining what we do or don't do. And then, of course, it's the council itself in terms of how they proceed with sanctions and defining certain groups in certain ways and whatnot. But if you look at the situation today in Mali, you have a crisscross of actors that in any given moment can be called any of these three terms, and yet the peace in northern Mali goes through a manner of integrating people who do not see themselves as citizens of the same state and country, who are trying to redefine borders, redefine the state, redefine their relationships. So it goes back to issues of identity, issues of governance, issues of development, and it's the lack of all those issues that I was referring to that gives rise, I think, to these phenomena. So to the extent that we're able to influence these agendas and create more inclusive spaces of participation, dialogue, and response to citizens is a way that we can, I think, promote this peace-building agenda from day one, I think, and even before a mission is established. It's this notion that peace building only happens after is also a big part of the problem. It's how do we frame peace operations, peace building as a consistent and continuous effort that zigzags into different domains and issues.
Yeah. I have a couple of minutes to take a few more questions. Mr. Ryan.
Thank you very much, and very glad that IPI has launched this series, and very pleased that both Oscar is the new head of PBS, so I think it will integrate a lot of. Oscar, I was very pleased that you, thank you, very pleased that you mentioned this issue of reconciliation, because I do think that hopefully in the sessions that IPI will host and the work that your review, Oscar, both the external and the internal, will pivot, I think, on that area of reconciliation, because I think that that's perhaps might be the missing piece, that both the sort of the bottom-up approach and the sort of the failure, that if one were to call it that South Sudan, and some of the other failures of the UN or countries might look at as where that we could do better on. And I just wonder, how your country studies are going to be framed to really sort of get an honest look, because often country studies can gloss over hard looks. And even on an issue of organized crime, it's the links with the elite, with the political elite, and maybe we'll get into that today, that the organized crime keep the people in power. So it's, it's a hard question, especially you're only in office 2 weeks, and one would have hoped that you had solved everything by week 1, Oscar. And week 2 you can be confused, but it's sort of a question of how you can use these studies to get some of the tough questions framed. But I'm really pleased that this reconciliation one, that you brought it up yourself here, because I do think it can get at the issue of dignity. It can get at the issue of that bottom up. It can really bring up, the question of approach of people really having a sense of being included, and not just a statist approach, that a top-down, because it's the failure of Liberia, it's the failure of many countries that didn't allow it to really happen, I think, in a lot of ways. So I do think it's a way of looking at peace building in a way that can help. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, good. Okay, so I think I'll leave this as a last question, then we have to wrap up. Thank you.
No, thank you. And again, I would like and hope and that much of what is going to be driving the review is not just about this very small peace-building support office. It's a system-wide issue. It's an architect issue. It's an architectural issue. It's how the UN member states interact in the domains that they do, and so I think it does. A lot of what we hope to be focusing attention is something that has to be also demand-driven, if you will. These are the issues that have been a consistent challenge across the spectrum of peacekeeping, special political missions, and the challenging work of UN country teams in countries going through difficult political transitions. The polite word of saying, countries that are increasingly going through an unreconciliation or the beginnings of an internal conflict. And so in terms of the case studies, I think, again, the team and PBSO has been, very proactively working with member states actually to get an agreement that to have meaningful recommendations that member states can take forward, we need to have some form of analysis emanating from case studies, field operations, if you will, so that recommendations are grounded on some analysis of what has worked, what hasn't worked. And so because it is a member state-driven process, even the selection of case studies requires quite a lot of negotiations between those who are going to be studied versus those who are proposing the countries to be studied. And we're in that process right now. But the idea, of course, again, because it is the peace-building architecture, there will be a component, and because I think one of the things that we want to ensure is that of course, that one of the critical parts of the evaluation is how can the Peacebuilding Commission per se become much more relevant, agile, effective, etc. I mean, how can it live up to its expectation, to what it was meant to be? Again, member states have made it what it has become, and it's for member states to somehow unshackle its potential. And for that to happen, I think there needs to be quite a lot of understandings about where is the value added, where is the relevance, and how do we define that, and what is the role of the UN actually in driving that support to the Peacebuilding Commission, just very much like we interact with the Council and other parts of our executive boards, etc. So that the case studies will be a mixture of countries where we think that the Peacebuilding Commission, with its ups and downs and different stories, was able to make a difference in terms of consolidation of peace and, if you will, bringing the fragility of some of these countries to and addressing them to a point where some of them can actually stand and walk on their own feet. And it's interesting because just as some countries were about to have been declared victorious, we've had this outbreak of Ebola right now. Again, challenging the fragility of these countries and actually starting to challenge some of the key political internal dynamics in terms of the response. And we keep going back to this issue of basic social services. Here is a health crisis that is now, again, putting into question the whole architecture of the state, the whole coherence and peace consolidation, if you will, achievements through an avenue that I don't think any mission on the ground in their own most sophisticated analysis would have seen this as a threat. And this, as you know, has been discussed as a threat, again, to peace and security. So interesting case study would be, for example, countries like Sierra Leone, where a huge amount of efforts were deployed through peacekeeping, special political mission, the peace-building country-specific configuration format. And so that might be an interesting case study in terms of what has been achieved, but how much still needs to be done to consolidate. Of course, I think sometimes we learn more from what hasn't worked. And so the relapse into violence, I think, case studies, which is a little bit more sensitive, and I think here member states are still to agree. But you mentioned one country, there are others. What we learn from that, I think, will be even, if not more important. I mean, where could the UN and member states and region have done more, and at what point and through what mechanisms? And so I think that will be an important part. But yet, I think, yes, reconciliation is an important part of what the UN does in peace building, and it's something that requires a sort of a whole of UN approach, and how some of the funding for these mechanisms that the Peacebuilding Fund can actually provide, because whether it's political missions or peacekeeping operations, part of the big challenge going forward is also this notion of what funding, for what purposes, through what means, with which partners. And so, again, thinking in terms of driving coherence through funding mechanisms, I think will be an extremely important one. And to have predictable opportunities to respond to reconciliation opportunities. It can't be an afterthought. It can't be because we have a great SRSG here and lesser ones elsewhere that these things are done or not done. It should be part of how we assess our performance. It's part of the accountabilities of when we deploy. This is what we deploy for. We deploy to build the institutions, to reconcile the societies, and to build peace. And this requires more than just deployment of UN staff. It's the programmatic intention and what we leave behind. But hopefully this is an agenda that this series of seminars and the reviews and the engagement throughout the UN system can set, the scope of work and the priorities going forward. And I think it is very much a collective exercise that we need to be supporting. So
yeah, definitely very, very important message, because I was thinking, also this proliferation of reviews in some way might risk to replicate that kind of silos, thinking, because ultimately it is about really an overarching strategy, and it's still unclear exactly where this overarching strategic thinking is happening. And so I think it's great that it's not just peacekeeping, but also political missions, for example. But capturing the connection between all the different reviews, I think it's one of the key element.
And if I can add, one of the key challenges we had, and Jordan can speak to it from experience, is this notion of how flexible and nimble, how we're able to rapidly, if you will, focus the efforts of the missions to the task at hand. And so we have great difficulties in deploying rapidly. We have great difficulties in transitioning between different forms and ways of dealing with peace-building challenges. We have huge gaps when missions leave and country teams are left on their own to deal with many of the issues that the mission, with protection mandates and the heavy presence of additional, allow these type of spaces that sometimes are not fully used. So again, predictability and a game plan, a strategy behind which the results of the UN is being gauged, again, I think is going to be very important. And how we define them collectively. What are peace building goals and how are we achieving them? I think it's part of the discourse. And that's hopefully what I'm expecting to get from some of these reviews, that we have much more clarity and much more, clarity and predictability in the response, that we're not reinventing the wheel every time we have an issue. And so again, to thank you for launching the debate.
Fantastic. Thank you.
We'll be avid listeners.
And all very excited of new positions, and we, of course, wish you best of luck, David. So thank you very much. We thought to start this session with a slightly different approach, and instead of setting up a traditional panel where everybody has a few minutes to make a point, to use a format that we call Ignite Talks. And Ignite Talks is basically something that most of you might be familiar with the TED Talks, where a speaker has roughly 10 minutes to make a point and to in some way ignite you and excite you about a particular topic. So there's not been enough time to go deep on a subject, but just to throw there a few insights. And we will then have a Q&A session where we can go a little more deeper, a little deeper than just Ignite. But the idea is to keep a little bit of rhythm and just throw you there a lot of insights that are coming out in these very days, actually, from different streams of research and different reports. So if we are we ready? Good. We have 4 speakers. And there is a slight logic in the way they are organized. I think we will start broader and go a little more specific as the presentation unfolds. So we are starting with Jesse Banfield. Jesse has actually just published a report with International Alert on crime and peace building specifically. So I think it's a perfect start because it is sort of a general framework, and I think you'll be very interested to hear some of the insights. Incidentally, I think the report is up there on the counter if you are interested. She will really focus on the links between organized crime, armed violence, and fragility. The way it works is that speakers have 10 minutes, and I will be extremely rigid. So I will signal when 1 minute is missing, when 30 seconds, and then the 10 minutes is closed. Okay? Jesse, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I feel like I'm on one of those reality shows where you have like 10 minutes to bake the cake or something. So I hope I'll manage it. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to be here with you. As Francesco has already indicated, I'm going to focus on sharing some findings from some research that I led for International Alert, which is just published. It's really an effort by the organization as one of the largest peace-building civil society actors to get to grips with some of the new data coming out on organized crime, responding to some of the new research, and also responding to our own observations around organized crime and the dynamics in some of the countries where we're working. The research methodology is basically a literature review seen through my eyes as somebody who's been involved in civil society peacebuilding interventions for a number of years. And we also commissioned peacebuilding activists themselves in each of Rio, Mana River Union countries and the Philippines to look at particular dynamics of organized crime, conflict, and fragility through their eyes as peacebuilding experts, seeking to uncover how much peacebuilding has or could be part of the response to those issues in those countries. So the report is available at the back of the room. And I think the first point I'd like to make is bringing the peacebuilding perspective to these issues is about bringing a new kind of analytical framework. For too long, I think it's now very well recognized that the law enforcement approach to criminality has tended on a sort of one-dimensional problem definition. And when we start bringing in conflict analysis tools, we of course begin to open up a much broader spectrum of issues. We clustered those issues in 3 broad problem clusters, if you like, and you could cut the cake in different ways. And I'm obviously not going to have time to open them up too much, but there is increasing recognition, I think, in some of the interesting reports that have been published recently and from our own case studies, that the political dimensions cannot be overlooked. The complicity of actors within the state in organized criminal networks, as has already been mentioned, is absolutely key, and finding creative ways to address that is also key. The flip side of the coin being that organized criminals themselves have political strategies which allow them to operate, and I think we'll be hearing more about that from James Cocaine. Globalized market structures. So it throws the topic very, very broad, but it must be part of the conversation, looking at the supply and demand and the market logic in a criminalized economy of the commodities which are traded through transnational organized crime, and opening up a number of issues around the global economy, again, which I can't go into here, but which need to be part of the solution. And then finally, crime incentives. So moving away from moralistic, pejorative responses to criminals and looking more deeply at what creates the conditions that brings people into a life of crime, not only the so-called foot soldiers, but also the criminal bosses. And that brings us back into looking at the socio-cultural, political context in which these dynamics are playing out. So 3 very broad sets of issues. And then using conflict analysis tools to sort of differentiate or begin to differentiate between which of these actually brings us to the point of violence, which are linking us to sort of broader fragility in the longer term. And we tried to map these out. I'm not going to talk through it, but maybe just to pick on one, there's a growing body of research that shows us how sometimes inadvertently locking up criminal bosses creates an anarchy in that particular criminal setting that actually leads to much more aggravated levels of violence. And I think Mexico becomes a classic case for that. So having used some of the analytical tools that we have as peace builders to try and broaden out the definition of the problem and then look for more holistic solutions, what does that then mean for peace building? And I wanted to pause on this. I was very glad to hear from the keynote speaker his contribution in terms of problematizing the way in which peace building has been institutionalized, because I think it's important. It's very encouraging to hear there's a review that's now going on. Although there are great leaps and bounds since the agenda of peace emerged in terms of how peace building is interpreted and understood in the international system, and it now has a very well-established place through a number of institutions and agencies that have emerged over the last 10 years in particular. Clearly there are constraints, and the state-centric nature of our international system is one of those. It also inevitably plays poor cousin to security, geostrategic interests, even more mainstream facets of international development around economic development, economic growth, against which peace building tends to play, as I said, a very sort of poor cousin role in different settings. And it was great to hear an emphasis on reconciliation, because that's often nowhere to be seen in terms of the funding and the priorities that we see coming through peace building programming. So I think there's a lot of issues which then affect our discussion in thinking about peace building's response to organized crime around how peace building is faring in the international system. We allowed ourselves the luxury in this research of sort of taking a side step from that debate. International Alert has produced another report which looks very, very closely at the New Deal through the lens of organized crime. And I think that's a very legitimate and important way forward to sort of map out the different institutions and instruments and look at each one of them in terms of how far they can respond and how they can be adapted to respond to organized crime. But in this report, we focus more on bringing the expertise of working in civil society-led initiatives and the kind of principles and approaches that emerge in terms of framing a response to organized crime, armed violence, and fragility. So some of those tools are, I've already mentioned, the importance of context analysis, distinguishing between different types of factor. Information flow, so not just within the institutions themselves, but really starting to see information generated and available to affected communities. And this came out so strongly from our case studies that people are really in the dark. Partly, I think, a consequence of the securitization of the issue. It is particularly opaque to citizens what governments and the international community are doing to respond to organized crime, right the way through to public health impacts on drugs. I mean, the sort of myths around those sorts of issues in some parts of the world are huge. Using context analysis to bring in the do no harm lens, particularly on law enforcement, is another suggestion. And then, again, I was very glad to hear the emphasis on dialogue, which resonates with one of the main messages of this report, which is that if we really want to see transformation of the nexus that we're talking about here today, creating platforms and opportunities for dialogue, not just here in New York, also within different policy institutions, but also, most importantly, among citizens, between citizens and policymakers in the different settings, so that solutions to the three complex areas around the global market structures, the crime incentives, the political dynamics, and how those unpack when we apply them to different commodities in different places, can begin to be generated and confidence built and the accountability loop closed, so that citizens are effectively empowered to work from the bottom up to transform these dynamics. And I wanted to close by reminding us of the successes of the natural resource governance issue, which, if we think 10 years ago, maybe a few more, 15 years ago, and IPA as it was then was of course very involved along with other actors. This was an issue that came onto the international stage. We now have EITI, Publish What You Pay, Kimberley Process, Natural Resource Governance Institute, Revenue Watch, so that citizens who are in countries affected by a dependence on natural resource governance and the risks that that presents have a ready-made vocabulary, policy recommendations, networks, funding mechanisms, and solidarity with which to begin to engage. And although that hasn't solved all the challenges that the world faces around natural resource governance, I think it's a good model that this conversation should be aspiring to in terms of really bringing the peace-building perspective onto transforming these issues.
All right. Excellent. So I think that was a perfect way to start off, and of course more is in the report. we now continue, and we have James Cockayne, who is the head of the UN office of the UN University. But he's someone who's been working on organized crime for many years, actually even in IPI years ago. And he will talk to us about how some criminal organizations strategically pursue political power and its implications and impact on peace, stability, and conflict. James, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Francesco. Good morning, everybody. In 1999, 15 years ago, a former CIA director, Jim Woolsey, was appearing before the US House of Representatives Committee on Banking. And he had a story to tell. He said, if you should strike up a conversation with an articulate English-speaking Russian gentleman in, say, the restaurant of a lovely hotel by the shores of Lake Geneva, and he says to you, I'm an executive of a trading company, and I'd like to enter into a joint venture with you, then there's four possibilities. The first possibility is that's exactly what he is. The second possibility is he's a Russian intelligence officer working under commercial cover. The third possibility is that he is a member of a Russian organized crime group. And the fourth and most interesting possibility is that he is all of these things, and all of those institutions are perfectly happy with that arrangement. 15 years later, that kind of converged criminal political business power is arguably more ubiquitous in the international system and has a profoundly corrosive impact on state institutions and legitimacy, on political processes, and, in other words, on our efforts to build peace. As we've learned the hard way in places like Mali, even as democracy seems to be flourishing, organized crime can be quietly hollowing out state institutions, legitimacy and effectiveness, and empowering non-state actors to emerge as rivals to the state in the provision not only of social services, but of protection itself. As we saw in the Balkans, and we're now seeing in Afghanistan, notionally post-conflict states also remain deeply vulnerable to these dynamics. Powerful informal wartime elites relying on ill-gotten wealth, wartime networks, and coercive power use the elections we encourage them to undertake and use the economic liberalization programs we encourage to extend their influence over formal state institutions while solidifying their control of criminal rents. The problem is that conflict actually seems to facilitate the organization of crime in three ways. First, it gives you access to a ready pool of trained criminal talent with few other life prospects. Second, it lowers the price of corruption. And third, it gives you political discourses in which you can embed your criminal activities, as Arkan's Tigers did during the Balkan Wars. So conflict arguably facilitates crime, but what's most troubling about recent research is that it suggests that also crime increasingly impedes our efforts to resolve conflict and build peace. Why? Well, four reasons. First of all, incentives for peace. It lowers them. Access to illicit markets lowers your incentive as a rebel to enter and remain in peace settlements. As I showed in a recent study for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, criminal agendas have disrupted and distorted peace processes and demobilization programs from Sierra Leone to Nigeria to Myanmar. Second, because access to illicit markets fractures command and control within militant groups, it complicates our mediation efforts and makes political settlements unstable. That's a major consideration in contemporary peace processes like the one currently ongoing in Cuba for Colombia. Third, as we've seen in the Great Lakes, cross-border raids connected to competition for control of trafficking routes can provoke armed intervention by neighboring states. This may be one reason why there's such a rise in the internationalization of conflicts over the last decade. And that's a major problem for us because research shows that if an external intervention doesn't quickly lead to a military result, then it is likely to make an internal civil war longer and much deadlier. That leads to a fourth problem, risks to civilians. If an armed group has access to external criminal rents and doesn't need local labor to extract them, then research is now suggesting that they're more likely to attack civilians. Why? Because they don't need their popular support to maintain their power. They have access to external support mechanisms. That last point arguably holds the key to a smarter approach to dealing with the impact of organized crime. For decades, criminologists have recognized that some criminal groups develop governmental power over certain markets and populations. But political scientists and international affairs specialists haven't followed that logic through to its natural conclusion. International relations theorists tend to bracket off crime. They argue that crime is distinct from politics because it pursues profits, not power. I suggest that that distinction is both unhelpful and inaccurate. For some organized criminal groups, the strategic goal is the pursuit of power. This, for example, is what this pentito, or Italian state witness, Marino Manoia, had to say to an interviewer about why he joined the mafia. Do you know why I became a mafioso? Because before, I had been a nobody in Palermo. And then afterwards, wherever I went, heads bowed. You can't value that in money, quote unquote. What distinguishes these kinds of criminal groups from classical political actors is not ultimately their objective, power, or status, it's the ways that they achieve power. It's their strategy. In my forthcoming book, Hidden Power, The Strategic Logic of Organized Crime, I argue that organized crime can usefully be understood as giving rise to a distinct strategic logic in the traditional politico-military sense, distinct from insurgency and distinct from terrorism. It's a covert strategy that seeks to hide the power of the groups that wield it. Criminal strategy aims at maximizing control of criminal rents. To do that, what you need is private criminal influence, not public political authority. But it is a strategy that any armed group, including factions of the state, can adopt. And when public actors, state officials, like Charles Taylor, for example, adopt a criminal strategy, that has a distinct, predictable, and deeply harmful effect. In my book, I use extensive new archival research using materials from the US, UK, Italy, and Cuba to show how mafias in those countries in the mid-20th century developed 6 criminal strategies and interacted with other wielders of governmental power, both states, political parties, and other armed groups. And this had very surprising impacts, not only on domestic governance, but at the international stage, including right here in New York. During World War II, the mob boss, Lucky Luciano, helped the US Navy to police and control the New York docks. My book shows that the mob also helped the US Navy catch 6 Nazi saboteurs that landed on Long Island in the Hamptons. They must have thought they were on holiday, I think. It helped the Navy plan and execute the invasion of Sicily. And then in wartime Sicily, the Allied military government relied on local mafia actors, who they knew were mafia actors, to exercise governmental power, sowing the seeds of political criminal collaboration in Sicily for decades to come. For example, a former governor of New York was installed as the most senior American civilian official in the Allied occupation government. He was known to have ties to the mob here in New York, and he installed as his interpreter somebody called Vito Genovese, who many of you will know went on to be the #1 mob boss in New York. He used that person at arm's length to control the black market in Sicily. And over time, as in Afghanistan, those local mob actors developed their own political strategy. For a while, even backing the secessionist bandit Salvatore Giuliano to create political leverage over the Allies and over political authorities in Rome. Elsewhere in the Caribbean, the mob first worked with Fulgencio Batista to develop a joint venture using state development financing institutions to grow the gambling, prostitution, and trafficking economies and reap the benefits. Over time, that led to the hollowing out of military institutions and paved the way for Castro's insurgency. So then the mob turned to the CIA. This is an old story. It's well known. The traditional argument is the CIA approached the mob to kill Castro. My archival research shows something quite different. Actually, the mob was already in on the act, was already staging transnational terrorist attacks from elsewhere in Central America into Cuba, and funded not one but two governments in exile, including hiring a Washington PR firm to push for those Cuban government in exile to be put back in power in Cuba so they could go back to their old system. What this all points to is something we know instinctively. There is an intimate relationship between politics and organized crime. We've just been ignoring this at the international level because it's such a sensitive issue in intergovernmental discussion. As Oscar Fernández-Taranco put it this morning, in a globalized world, we really can't afford to do that anymore. If we're to have any realistic chance of securing political settlements and building peace, we have to take the strategic logic, the political legitimacy of these groups seriously. And just one final example. This is a local protesting the Jamaican government's arrest and extradition of Dudas Coke, who was a local gang boss in Kingston. The signs they're using to protesting are fascinating. The first one says, Dudas is a better security officer, i.e. we feel better protected by him than we do by the state. And the second one shows you what kind of serious political legitimacy these people can have. It says, taking our boss is like taking Jesus. That's some serious political legitimacy. So how do we deal with this? Well, it's going to require not just military and law enforcement approaches, and not just structural programming, but an inherently and avowedly political approach, an approach that takes the political agency of these organizations seriously. After all, if criminal groups have political power, then we can only defeat them through political strategy. We have to find ways to woo them back into the political settlements underpinned by the state. Thank you.
Thank you, James, and also for reminding me that the country I come from has a broad contribution to peace and stability in the world. First speaker, Catalina Uribe Burker, is that correct? Burker, who is a program officer at IDEA, and she also just finished working on a report which focuses on illicit networks, peace, and democracy in Latin America. So we are going to zoom into that part of the world and see some of these interconnection with Catalina. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for this invitation. I'm very excited to be here because this is something that we've been working on at International IDEA for over the past 3 years, looking at the nexus between organized crime and politics and how it affects stability around the world, including in Latin America, where we just published this book entitled Illicit Networks and Politics in Latin America. And this is an important but a very widely ignored issue, as we see in many of the municipalities where we have carried out case studies that actually violence diminishes as these relations become more entrenched. And this is perhaps not surprising, given that organized crime doesn't need to challenge the state in order to gain territorial control over these places where they have interests. This is very worrisome because, well, the fact that violence diminishes is good, but it takes away the public and media attention away from these places and these relations. I would say that the Iguala case and the example is very telling, because even though these relations between local authorities and the Guerreros Unidos crime syndicate had been going on for several years, it wasn't until these 43 students were disappeared, this tragic event took place, that the media and the public started paying attention. And the problem is that the long-term consequences of these interlinkages between organized crime and politics are very damaging, as James just mentioned, for the quality of democracy and peace around the world. It's important because particularly in fragile and conflict-affected states, we see how governments or how people trust their governments least and least. Transparency International has highlighted year after year how people distrust their governments and particularly consider political parties as the most corrupt institutions in their countries. Also, the World Bank, OECD, etc., highlight how illicit financial flows originating from organized crime drain the state from much needed resources for building capable institutions, which are very much needed in those contexts of conflict and fragility. So this is not a new problem, and also, as James mentioned, this goes back several years. Organized crime is not new. Political corruption certainly is not new, but the current trends regarding both organized crime and politics, particularly in Latin America, but this is common in other regions as well, make this problem very cumbersome for law enforcement agencies, particularly at the local level, to identify and tackle. With regards to organized crime, there are three characteristics that I can mention here that make the problem very cumbersome. First is the structure of organized crime that nowadays is structured more as networks instead of these hierarchical, vertical structures that we were used to seeing in the 1980s and 1990s. And this makes it easier for these networks to engage with politicians as their relations are much more flexible and fluid, oftentimes not mediated by sort of quid pro quo arrangements, but rather tacit arrangements through the so-called shadow facilitators, which makes it very hard for law enforcement officers to identify and tackle those relations. Secondly, we see the localized nature of organized crime. I mean, even though their interests are transnational, their activities are localized in those places where they have interests, be those ports, borders, etc. So that puts extra challenges to local authorities, which oftentimes in these scenarios are weak, and especially in those places that have suffered weak decentralization processes. It's very hard to exercise good oversight over politicians and criminals. And lastly, we have the huge amounts of money that organized crime generates. According to UNODC, approximately 1.5% of the world's GDP originates from organized crime activities, out of which half of it is believed to come from the drug trade, and cocaine is still the most lucrative market. So this puts Latin America in a very vulnerable position, as it is still the region where most cocaine is produced and trafficked from. So this comes coupled with the other side of the coin, which is the shape of politics nowadays. And I'll also mention three characteristics that makes this problem very worrisome. First of all is then the cost of politics, because according to various estimates, running for elections is more costly than ever before. So this, together with weak implementation of political finance regulations, make politics a very attractive avenue for organized crime to launder money. Secondly, we see a problem with the fragmentation of political parties. There is literally an explosion, well, not literally, but there is an explosion of movements and individual candidates, especially at the local level, running for elections, which takes away a layer of scrutiny and oversight that traditionally political parties had against their or vis-a-vis their members and candidates. And thirdly, we see the politicization of the bureaucratic apparatus across the region. Again, particularly at the local level, there is a tendency for politicians, when elected, to distribute bureaucratic quotas across their informal networks of influence, which makes this problem not just a problem of political corruption, but something that permeates the whole state structure, particularly the police force, the port authorities, the border authorities. So this is certainly a big challenge. including for peace building. So I already mentioned some of this, and James explained how organized crime can cement the weaknesses that some of these places suffer from. And we confirmed this through a series of the case studies we gathered in the region. I would just mention, for example, the cases of Guatemala and Colombia. Colombia, after the 2005 peace process with the paramilitary groups, suffered from, in some municipalities, basically recycling of the manpower and routes and some of the infrastructure that those groups had, and basically organized crime just rebranded those groups as the new BACRIM or organized crime gangs. And something similar has happened in Guatemala, although a bit different because there, during the dictatorship, these crime activities were largely controlled by the central state. And peace efforts have struggled to dismantle those structures that are largely run through the state. So, but I have to say, not everything is bleak, and we can certainly learn a lot from these past examples for facing or going ahead into new peace-building efforts. And I can mention here perhaps the process, the current negotiation process with the FARC guerrilla in Colombia, which where we can definitely, some of these lessons can be learned and applied. I would say, for example, with regards to the disarmament, the mobilization and reintegration process, there are great chances for at least weaken part of the manpower and the infrastructure that organized crime enjoys through the at least partnership, if not the direct involvement of FARC in these activities. With regards to transitional justice, there is also a possibility to shed light into the crimes committed during conflict, much of which also has some element of organized crime in it. So there is a chance to shed light into those activities and structures as well. Thirdly, a strong security sector reform process can definitely continue cleaning security agencies from these corrupt practices that have come to a large extent from organized crime interests. And last but not least, the process has, at least so far, taken into account the rural development that is needed. And this is very important in the case of Colombia because it's in those localities that have been particularly isolated from the central state and where service delivery has been weak, where the chances for actually also tackling some of the root causes for organized crime activities can be tackled. So we see with great optimism, cautious but optimism, the possibilities to learn from these past examples in order to build better peace in the future. So thank you.
Thank you. It's great. It's the first Ignite talks. I don't have to interrupt anyone. So perfectly timed. That may change. And might change with our fourth speaker, Noreen Chowdhury-Fink, who is now the head of research and analysis at the Global Center on Cooperative Security, and has been working on counterterrorism for many years, and particularly focused on the role of the UN. And she will talk about the links between countering violent extremism and peacebuilding.
Thank you, Francesco, and good morning, everybody. Now that you've been ignited by the previous three speakers, I can relax a little when I speak. But in any case, I will be speaking not so much about organized crime and peace building, but as Francesco mentioned, on violent extremism. And semantics do matter, so you'll notice throughout the morning I'll speak about violent extremism and not extremism. So to set the scene a little bit, this emerging area of policy and practice known as countering violent extremism, or CVE, is premised on the understanding we heard about this morning that militarized responses to threats like terrorism and violent extremism are insufficient and ineffective for delivering a response in the medium to long term. So why are we talking about CVE and peace building in the same breath? Because both of them have as a key objective the prevention of violence and conflict. This is, of course, not to say that the goals are identical, but that there is some convergence that warrants greater integration in the response. Why? Because, as we heard about this morning, the nature of conflict is increasingly complex and requires a multidimensional response. And we've been saying this for a number of years now as we've seen this dynamic unfold. But the scale of the transnationalization and the scale of globalization has been made particularly visible, I would say, in the most current debate we're having on counterterrorism, which is this question of, for example, foreign terrorist fighters. We're looking at, in the last 3 years, about 15,000 men and women going from 80 countries to fight in Iraq and Syria. And I mention this and bring up this visualization because you can see the countries that fighters are coming from are countries that are at risk, are vulnerable, and have some instability or ongoing violence. So this is simply to make the point that the scale and the integration of the threat is increasing. And we've seen, of course, that these blurred lines between traditional and non-traditional armed groups that we heard about this morning, the use of terrorist tactics by insurgents, armed groups, rebels, and the difficulty in really delineating between the two really requires a new way of thinking about it, one that is far more sort of complex and multi-layered in its approach. I pull up this map. It's a little hard to see. Sorry about that. The top one is looking at areas of sort of conflict hotspots. The second one is really looking at extremist and sort of terrorist acts, and you can see certainly overlap in a lot of countries where there is conflict and certainly where there are a lot of potential drivers of conflict. Which brings me to the first key point I wanted to talk about, which is that violent extremism should be thought of as both a product and a driver of conflict, which calls for a greater integration of peace building and CV approaches. Why? Our understanding of the radicalization process to date indicates that there is no linear typology, and the process of radicalization can be nonlinear, can be sequential, can be fast, can be slow, and in some cases the process of radicalization may not even be a necessary condition for someone to join an extremist group. Why? Because many who support or join extremist groups may not do so for any reason related to ideology, but as we heard this morning, maybe more to do with grievances, social pressures, kinship ties, identity challenges, or, and not to underestimate this, simply because it looks cool. It looks like fun, it gives a little edge. And I say this because when we talk, for example, about foreign terrorist fighters, we're talking about extremely young, I'd say kids, looking at the internet, getting excited and traveling aboard. We're thinking 14, 15, 16-year-olds. So that perception of coolness, that sort of insight, that attractiveness to deal with your identity at that age shouldn't be undermined. We also know that prolonged conflict contributes to what the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy calls conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism, and we see that the narrative of conflict provides critical ingredients into the recruiting and communication strategies of extremist groups. I do work largely on Al-Qaeda-inspired extremist groups, so you'll see a pattern. I wanted to bring up these three quotes that I'll talk about next because I think it's really important to think about how conflict and violent extremism relate to each other. This is a quote from Anwar al-Awlaki, who was with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, talking a lot about why ongoing conflict really affected a change in his approach from non-violent to violent jihad. Similarly, with Omar Hamami, we've seen that they've used the language of both conflict and of peace building and state building to justify their work, to attract recruits and create some kind of legitimacy. And finally, I wanted to use an image of ISIS we don't see so often, not the big sort of cloak and dagger black flag, but this kind of image that they put out in their English language magazine, Dabiq, really to use the language of state building, the provision of services we heard about this morning, filling that governance gap, and really how they justify and attract recruits. So if you want to go join a group like ISIS, it doesn't have to be simply because you believe in violent extremism. It may be that you want to help help compensate for some deficiency of governance or come help build a better state, however you see it. But I think these are three very important quotes and images to keep in mind, because the narrative of conflict and violent extremism is not as siloed or insulated as it may be in departments at headquarters. Which brings me to that key second point, the importance of convergence and divergence between CVE and peace-building approaches. I've taken a stab at drafting some initial thoughts on this. Why are we talking about CVE? What is so new about CVE that it warrants another discussion? Certainly from the security side, from the side of counterterrorism practice, it has required a rethinking to the approach to terrorism and non-traditional, non-state-centric security threats. There has been much more of a focus through CVE policy and practice to be more inclusive, to focus on local perceptions and actors, to promote community resilience, and better understand that relationship between grievances and drivers of conflict and the support for violent extremism. This means that in many instances, responses look a lot less like the traditional law enforcement, militarized counterterrorism response you see, on 24-Hour Homeland, but that the responses look a lot more like development or education or, in fact, peace building. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this because particularly in the areas of convergence, a running theme through all these principles is something we heard about this morning, inclusion. There's been at least a progress in CVE policy and discourse that inclusive approaches are in fact critical, that working at the state level, at the policy level will only go so far. You need to bring it down to the community in terms of both identifying the threat and developing an effective, sustainable, and in fact resonant response. So we see that CVE practitioners have sought to address and understand the drivers of violent extremism, to mitigate and resolve ongoing conflicts insofar as they drive violent extremists support. We see a promotion of a multidimensional approach. We see an emphasis on boosting national capacities, whether it be educators, whether it be development agencies, whether it be police officers, to think of CVE and this cycle of grievances, radicalization, extremism, and think about intervention points in a different way rather than coming in with boots on the ground right as soon as you've already had the terrorist attack. So much more of a focus on prevention. I didn't want to belabor convergence and make it sound like they completely overlap, because I think there is an important area of divergence also. We have heard concerns about the securitization of approaches and how CVE and peace building can in fact be at odds with one another. We have heard concerns that CVE in a way can be a label that's applied to anything and everything, and there needs to be a little bit more thought about, in fact, how CVE and peace building differ from one another. Good fences make good neighbors. If we understand what the objectives are in each field a little better, a little more nuanced, we have a better chance at more effectively integrating the two areas of practice. So I just wanted to put this out there to bring me to that third key point, which is actually a lie because it's the third point, which has 3 subpoints. How we link CVE and peace building at the UN, because I figured that's what we're here to talk about today, and that's the community in which we're standing. 3 simple ideas. The need for more integrated responses. We've heard a lot about multidimensional conflicts. We've heard a lot about new mandates, multidimensional peacekeeping. But here in Turtle Bay, I would venture to say there's very little practical interaction between the counterterrorism side of the House, and by that I mean the UN, and certainly a lot of the peace operations side of the House. That's changing a lot, and I think we are seeing good progress in that. So this is simply a push to continue down that line and on a very practical level increase the interaction, because there's a number of tremendous resources there that are being underutilized. This also means that we need enhanced coordination not only at the UN and but also in capitals and in the field. A number of key member states are involved in CVE activities and peace building activities, sit on whether they're in the council or various decision-making bodies at the UN, and are often supporting, of course, streams of work that may be complementing each other, so missing opportunities for synergies, but may also be at odds with one another. And there's a great opportunity sitting here in Turtle Bay to actually enhance coordination at the member state headquarter level and to push for that to trickle down to the field. And finally, this was mentioned, and I was really glad to hear it this morning during the keynote, improve the UN strategic communication. When we think about violent extremism, we deal a lot in the world of perceptions, narratives, attractiveness, and I think that the UN has a really good story to tell in many instances, which it really doesn't. There's a lot of opportunities, shall we say, to enhance the UN strategic communications, to put forward the positive alternatives and challenge a lot of the extremist narratives. And that means that a lot of the good work being done and information about it needs to go to key target communities. We hear a lot from NGOs, from implementers and communities we work with in the field. They think the UN doesn't care about human rights when it's working on counterterrorism. They don't think the UN cares about women's rights when they're thinking about what extremist groups are doing, when in fact we know that there are efforts underway at the UN to address these. Many of them are still unfolding, but the efforts are there and the information about it needs to get out so that the UN's message and its narrative can be more powerful than that of extremists. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. So if I can invite the four speakers maybe to sit up here. I think there is a lot of food for thought and very interesting points. Myself will be very interested to hear more about some of those. But I would like to take maybe a couple of questions or comment from the audience to the panel, broadly speaking, or to a specific presenter. If you have any follow-up question, we have roughly 15 minutes. So please. Anyone? Chris? Please, Chris.
Question. Very quick question. Inclusion's a big buzzword that everybody's used. Inclusion in what? Because ISIS can answer that question pretty clearly, in my opinion. They've got a good narrative. They've got a good story. You're going to be part of this. It's well articulated. For the international community, I think it's much less so. In my area of work, DDR, we can't define reintegration. It's terrible. It's not a good offer in most cases for ex-combatants that have been involved in something. And it's very amorphous when you talk about when the international community says, come on over. To us, to what? To a state that's corrupt? To what are you talking about? So I'd just like to hear some reflections on the inclusion in what, and maybe with specific, because I'm selfishly involved in DDR, involvement and some reflection on that. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there a question there? Can I take another one? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Matti Lehtonen with the UN Environment Program, UNEP here in...
You're going to have to speak up, sorry.
I'm Matti Lehtonen with UNEP, UN Environment Program here in New York, and I was especially interested in the part of the global markets and the role of private sector. As in peacebuilding, you also have a new role for private sector actors. And coming from the more natural resources and peacebuilding side, I'm thinking of the supply chain due diligence, which has been somewhat of a good innovation, has brought some new tools for the private sector also to impose due diligence on, let's say in the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the mobile phone producer would make sure that the smelter is doing their job when they are buying from the producer. Now for that, you have needed a system where you can certify the clean, in this case, the minerals needed. And you have needed things like the Dodd-Frank Act, which is a legal obligation to be transparent of where your raw materials are coming from. But my question to you is that when we are getting to the fields which are much more nuanced, is there a possibility to use also the private sector in these efforts? And I can imagine already thinking of the information needs. For example, banking sector, you would have a lot of those information, and how to connect to private sector is basically my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Please. Can we maybe bring a roaming mic? Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I would like first of all to thank the panelists.
Introduce yourself, sorry. Can you just briefly introduce yourself?
I'm Atlas from the Mission of Morocco. I would like first of all to thank all the panelists for their enriching expose, which actually there is a point of cross line between all what they have said in as far as the situation in the world right now, mainly in the Middle East. I would like to focus on peace building. Actually, the idea is that sometimes we find ourselves that we are reaching a point where we can see, let's say, the end of the tunnel. All of a sudden, everything collapses and we comes back. And the case of Libya is a case in point, as well as the case of Yemen, in the sense that we had reached, let's say, just last week, there was a meeting at the Security Council and everybody was actually saying that they support Bernardino, I mean the Secretary General envoy and personal envoy and the peace process. Suddenly there is this decision of the Supreme Court which annuls all, let's say, the elections that came before, and we feel that everything collapsed and there is no way. The same thing happens also in Yemen. So we were reaching, I mean, the end of the tunnel, so that there is going to be, and all of a sudden there is this breakout. And she mentioned the idea of information flow. This information can either have, let's say, a good side in the sense that it contributes to peace building, or at the same time for drawbacks. So this is my question is that how can we, I mean, react to these situations? For the CVE, I mean, I thank also the panelists which come in this idea. There are points of similarities, or let's say intersections between peace building and at the same time what foreign fighters, when they come and they just, the case of ISIS is that we don't see only, there isn't only the bad side that we see, but they have, let's say, that inclusiveness, that services that they do, which can also attract people, and the use of the internet to attract mainly young people. So what is the way to do, I mean, to stop this influence and to sensitize this public of the internet not to be actually attracted? Before we used to say that it's poverty which has driven people to go and fight. Now we find that there are engineers, there are some university students who go, which is really a pity, and not from poor countries. It's coming from very, I mean, rich countries, which even the level of education is very high. And we find that also students from universities go in. So what is the analysis that you can give for this? And thank you.
Thank you. Please, Michelle here, and then I can, yeah, Michelle, please.
Thanks, Michelle Griffin from the Secretary General's office. A slightly more pragmatic and parochial question, which I'd like to actually hear from each of the panelists on, if that's possible. Oscar mentioned the peacebuilding review, but obviously there's also this peace operations review that has just been launched or is about to be launched. And my question to each of the panelists would be, recognizing that, you know, there's limited bandwidth politically to make major change right now, recognizing the extent to which peace operations are not necessarily the perfect tool, but they're the tool we have very often. What are the key things you would like to see change, maybe via this panel, that could at least begin to kind of address the discrepancy between the situations we're dealing with and the tools we have? Thanks.
Great, thank you. I have one question there, and then I come back to the table. Are you okay? Yeah. Can I keep collecting a couple, and then we go back to you? Okay, please.
Well, hello. I'm actually a student, so I'm learning a lot at this point. Mr. Cocaine actually mentioned that the main solution to battle, the main solution to battle organized crime would be to have a political strategy or to have a political solution to these problems. Now, then Mrs. Bucher mentioned that actually 50% of the revenue of organized crime is drugs. So I wanted to ask a question for Mr. Cocaine. Is it actually is one of the political strategies that could be considered feasible is actually policies that would go towards a legalization of drug substances?
Thank you. I think one more, Rachel, here. You should have a mic on the table.
Thank you. Rachel Locke, I'm with USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation. So one of the sort of main tenets of peace building and inclusivity is sort of understanding that there are different norms and values that different individuals and groups bring to an issue. And so I found it sort of interesting that we're all talking about organized crime without unpacking it a little bit and thinking about and talking about how organized crime may be defined and understood here in New York around the UN in a very different way than it's defined in different countries, by different communities, by different individuals. And I think there's a lot of people starting to talk about this in a very useful way in preparation for UNGAS 2016 on drug policy reform, and looking at Bolivia, and looking at Colombia, and looking at Uruguay, and looking at Washington State, and looking at New York City, where they've just changed their what happens to you if you're caught with a small amount of marijuana is you get a summons and you don't go to jail. So there's lots of changes that are happening that are reflecting different norms and values. And so I thought it was interesting that none of you really seemed to raise that when talking about peace building and the nexus between what the peace building community can bring to the conversation of organized crime. And I suppose the question is, if I can formulate one, how can the peace-building community help to provide that sort of multi-dimensional, real inclusive understanding of organized crime, understanding that different individuals, different communities will bring different values to it? Thanks.
Thank you. Wow. Okay, so we have 1 hour? No, only 10 minutes. So some were directed to one of you specifically. Others are, more general questions. So feel free to address what you wish. Should we go in order of the presentations? You want to start?
Okay, I'll try. Maybe starting with your question, Rachel. I mean, I think what I was trying to get across with this emphasis on dialogue and really getting people talking about different aspects of the nexus between organized crime and violence is in part, I think, a response or one kind of a strategy that could be deployed to get at what you're getting at, i.e. creating spaces for people to come in and air some of their prejudices and beliefs and misinformation that, particularly in West Africa, in the case study that we had around drug use and how stereotyped and really how many misperceptions there are around what goes behind that and so on. And so using that setting as one way of getting at people's norms and values around it. And then on the other end, thinking about the norms and values in consumer countries, and going a bit to the guy from UNEP's question around the awareness that, drugs are consumed in rich countries, and yet the debate is so far behind where it is on other commodities which have pernicious effects in supply countries. So where the awareness is there on the blood diamonds to some extent, the sort of sweatshop discourse is fairly well evolved, although it doesn't stop people shopping in Primark and the rest. The debate doesn't seem to be there, even though we're heading towards 2016. So the idea of coalition building and increasing the public debate around how the global supply and demand economy affects violence and fragility, I think, is something that really needs some attention and some work. Whether there's a role for the private sector in that, because the nature of the commodities are, as you rightly hinted, often sort of off the map of the legitimate private sector. One issue that we touched on in the alert report is that the whole concept of really police or solving this problem through policing of ports is unfeasible, because the economy relies on, and the private sector relies on, corporate profits rely on fast-moving transit points. So to sort of, if you sort of follow the logic that policing every container will never happen, we have to start looking for solutions that are in the normative realm and around people's perceptions and so awareness. I'll stop there. I mean, there was more.
Thank you. James.
Thanks. Wonderful questions, very rich. I will try to be brief and answer only half of them. The first comment, though, is what a pleasure it is to be the only man on a security-related panel. Well done to IPI and all the other conveners, and apologies for polluting the gender balance. I'm going to take Chris, Michelle, and the gentleman from Morocco's questions together first. Chris's question was heading in the direction of what are we asking people to reintegrate into because they don't trust states. I want to quote two Frenchmen, which is dangerous. The first is well known around here, Jean-Marie Guéhenno, who likes to say occasionally that the United Nations is a trade union for states. It's of, by, and for states. We just have to accept that. We are promoting statehood. So we better promote a responsible form of statehood if we want people to continue to trust it. But juxtapose against that another Frenchman, Michel Foucault, who said once, the state is but a mere episode in governmentality. In other words, there are alternatives, and that's what we've all been talking about. Globalization makes it easier for other people to find political discourses through the internet, through Dabiq. If they can get guns, they can get money. They are viable alternatives at the local level now, tapping into globalized transnational flows. We have to take that seriously, and we need a strategic communication strategy across the UN that much more aggressively and deliberately promotes the benefits of statehood, and that says, when we send you a peace operation, we're not going to leave you 3 years later with a perfect state, but we're going to leave you better off than you were during conflict, and we're going to plant the seeds of change and water them in a way that evidence shows will push you in the right direction. Then it's up to you. We'll be there to support you, but we can't do it for you, but we'll help you get started. But we don't have that kind of narrative right now. So for Michelle's question, what exactly should we recommend to the Peace Operations Review? On organised crime, I'm not going to touch the CVE question, but on organised crime, I would say 3 things. 1, the Security Council has been asking the Secretary General for 5 years to integrate these issues into his planning and analysis. It's happening a bit in analysis, but in a non-systematic way. It struggles in planning. So we should be taking that call, that invitation much more seriously, and we need to be equipping the system with the analytical skills to read these dynamics in the ways that we're talking about today. And putting that not only at the technical level, but at the strategic level in DPKO, and particularly in mission leadership organizations in the field. Secondly, we need to give our organizations in the field much more flexible funding and personnel supply structures, or good luck on all of this. Thirdly, we need to clarify the narrative, and what that comes down to operationally is benchmarks. What are the realistic benchmarks for what peace operations should be expected to achieve in 3 to 5 years? The rule of law indicators we have, I can say this because our university's charter from the General Assembly gives us academic autonomy. Unrealistic. Huge amounts of money, 13 to 17 weeks to roll out, can't give you real-time feedback in the field, only implemented in 3 countries. They tell you how you're going against where you need to get to. But as a result, what you can only see is we're doing really badly against where we need to get to, because rule of law building takes at least 27 years. We know that from the World Bank. At least 27 years. Peace operations should be looking at 3 to 5 years. So we need a set of indicators and benchmarks that show you, okay, the 27-year indicators, we've still got a hell of a long way to go, but on the 3 to 5 year indicators and what we know from evidence about how to get this process moving in the right direction, we're doing pretty good. I'm taking up too much time. Let me just finally say on drugs, It's a very interesting question. It's a live question in the UN system. You can come to the United Nations University event on Monday in Conference Room 8 from 3 to 5 p.m., The Road to UNGAS 2016, which is exactly about these questions. There is a very live question here. We have an opportunity with the General Assembly special session in 2016 to take these questions seriously and to think about what evidence shows works in the drug control field. That's up to member states to figure out ultimately. But there is a real question. We set up this regime 60 years ago. Life has moved on. We live in a globalized world. Maybe the markets don't operate the way now that they did 60 years ago. Maybe we need to take all of that evidence into account and adjust policy accordingly. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, James. Catalina.
Okay. I'll just go briefly into two of the questions raised on global markets and the role of the private sector. I think it's a key issue to bear in mind, as we see also in all of these cases and the operations of organized crime, particularly in Latin America, how the we cannot delink the private sector from these networks, as we see increasingly that it's not the capo boss of the past, it's more of a business men and women being or sort of having both faces in the legal and illegal markets. But I think engaging private sector is key, and you mentioned sort of corporate social responsibility mechanisms. And this is something, for example, now we're looking into at least sharing some of the experiences of some business people into applying those criteria in real cases in settings of where organized crime and political corruption is very pervasive. For example, now we have a project in Peru with USAID ahead of the 2016 elections, and I think engaging the private sector in this process is going to be key. And with regards to sort of connecting the questions from the Moroccan colleague and Michelle in respect to what to do for ahead of sort of the review of peace operations and peace building in general, I think I can't go into details with regards to everything that we consider important, but I can just say that from international ideas perspective, it's important that when taking into account the organized crime dimension, that this is seen as not only a law enforcement issue, but a democracy and political issue as well. So that, for example, considerations of elections and not only having free and fair elections, but how electoral campaigns are run and the money that goes into elections is taken into account. The functioning of political parties, how political parties at the local level particularly can be strengthened so that they can shield political operations at the local level from the influence of organized crime is key. And thirdly, the issue of democracy that delivers and service delivery. I think development at the local level is key to diminish the capacity organized crime has to spoil peace in these localities. As James and Oscar Taranco, Fernández-Taranco mentioned, the capacity of organized crime networks have to provide basic services is something that gives them legitimacy against the public. And we see, for example, in Guatemala, in the municipality of Malacatán, just between the border with Mexico, how people reacted very strongly, similarly to the case in Jamaica, when one of these crime bosses was apprehended, because they were the ones providing services to the people. So taking into account more seriously this connection between democracy and development and how organized crime is part of that is key to make peace operations more effective. So I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you. Nurin.
Sure. I'll take on Chris's question about inclusion, and I think would be helpful to look at it from two perspectives. When we look at CVE in the field and we think about inclusion, what do we mean? We mean engaging actors at the state level, but also making sure we engage communities and civil society actors, where when we think about prevention of violent extremism, they will be key. Now, practically, what does that look like? It means doing research and perception studies, or speaking with them and engaging to understand where the threat of violent extremism is most felt, and how it's perceived. In a number of locales where we work, in a number of countries, no one wants to admit that their kids might be terrorists or their kids like terrorists or anything. So they say terrorism is not a problem. Violent extremism, they may be willing to say is a problem, but then you name certain groups, like people say, yeah, we don't want our kids joining Shabab. No, we definitely don't want our kids going to join ISIS. And suddenly you find that the semantics really matter. And when you talk about the groups and the kind of impact that those groups can have on their security and stability, you get a clearer understanding of where the threat of violent extremism or how it's most felt. Why do I say that? Because then the response needs to be tailored accordingly. A little too often, CVE initiatives are cooked up in capitals, cooked up by donors, and aren't necessarily related more closely to how and where the communities most feel the threat. So that disconnect is where inclusion can most effectively play a role. At headquarters, I think there are a number of existing mechanisms that could help that integration aspect I talked about. Ulrich can talk later about the Counterterrorism Implementation Task Force, for example. It has a number of sort of dormant members or members that have not been terribly active among these 34 UN entities that are involved in the CTITF. Very few are regularly engaging or interacting in shaping the initiatives and the policies. And I think that's one practical way we could take inclusion forward at headquarters, and we can certainly pick up on that. On the reviews, that's a multi-million-dollar question in 1 minute, but I'll say that I think what would be really helpful is to take stock of really what the nature of conflict means about the kinds of roles that the UN can actually play, and take sort of an honest assessment about where the UN's comparative advantage is and focus on that. The UN is not going to be sort of the SWAT team that eliminates a terrorist group militarily, but there are certain places where the UN can play a very effective role. Communications and narratives is one of them. Governance and supporting effective peace building is another one. And then I would say that having taken stock of the kind of roles the UN can most effectively play, strengthen partnerships. Sure, the UN may be a state-centric organization, maybe a trade union for states, but that doesn't really prevent more effective partnerships. In the realm of CVE, for example, there's the Global Counterterrorism Forum. That's 29 countries plus the EU. They're doing a lot of work on the ground. There's great opportunity for partnerships there. There are NGOs, civil society actors that are that play a role in providing, whether it's research or implementation support to the UN. And when you deal in that nexus between the state and communities in a realm like civil society, governance, and peace building, I think strengthening those partnerships is a way to go forward in the new century, as you said.
Fantastic. Excellent. I think you've done a fantastic job to answer very, very complex questions. I think it was a great way to start. We got a lot of insights, but also a lot of food of thought that I think we can inject into our sessions after the break. So I want to thank you very much for your contribution. I wish you continue to work on these topics, because there is a lot of need also to challenge sort of a conventional wisdom and a sort of political instinct that we have, and really learn to do things differently. So thank you very much. I'm sorry, I really have to close, but if you stay for next session, we are going to have a group of experts actually from the field, so we're telling us interesting things from what is actually happening on the ground, and then over lunchtime a session that really particularly focused on the role of the United Nations. So thank you very much. We have a 15-minute break, and then we'll gather here for session number 2. Thank you.